the EU, what's in it for Africa?
So in Europe today, in the EU, what's in it for Africa? I would say a lot of opportunities.
In this first episode, I'm going to be speaking to you about the rationale behind the show and also sitting down to speak to Annie Mutamba. She's the co-founder of a public affairs firm dedicated to Africa-EU issues. So let's start with the rationale behind the show. So first of all, Europe is Africa's biggest trade and investment partner, which actually means the relationship is a bit more interdependent. Also, we know that over the past decade, Africa has been one of the fastest growing economies in the world. This actually means that it's becoming increasingly an important global player. And on the flip side, Europe is currently negotiating with the US the world's biggest trade deal, TTIP, and this could have implications by diverting trade away from Africa. Another timely issue, economic partnership agreements. Along with the Pacific and Caribbean regions, Africa is currently finalising the negotiations on these hotly contested trade agreements with the EU. And finally, there's also a recent eagerness from African countries, but also European ones, to move away from the traditional relationship that's really based on aid handouts. So what I'm really saying is the time is right for us to sit down and ask ourselves the question about EU policy and what's in it for Africa. So we're lucky enough to be joined today by Annie Mutamba. She's the co-founder of a public affairs firm specialising specifically on giving advice on Africa-EU affairs. Welcome to the show, Annie.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on. So I'll just launch into the questioning. I'd like to know from you your perspective on the Africa-EU relationship today.
Probably not the most appealing relationship of all. The old continent versus the new frontier, but I think both continents understand that they have to work together, and with ties that are so deeply rooted in history, it's important to develop common solutions to global challenges. We have this year very important negotiations for sustainable development goals, climate, financing for development, and it's important for both Europe and Africa to come up with common positions if possible, and this may be a way to refresh the relationship.
So you've highlighted a couple of key issues, climate change and development. So what would you say are kind of the most important policy issues on an EU level for Africa?
I think we need to look beyond the obvious. When we consider the EU-Africa relationship, we often think of development, trade, migration, agriculture. These policies we know have an impact on Africa.
Yeah.
But it's important to look beyond climate, energy, the research and innovation agenda for Europe. But it's difficult to understand if we do not look at the EU industrial policy as a whole or the EU research agenda. We need to be able to connect the dots.
Yeah, that's important. So leading on from that, do you think there is enough discussion about how EU policy can affect Africa?
Well, discussion certainly not. I would say that in general, the African approach to anything EU is way too passive.
Yeah.
But it's a two-way street, because the discussion is not happening here either on the EU policy implication for Africa.
I suppose a natural way of doing that is sort of in the media. So what would you say about the media coverage of the discussions about political interactions between the continents, not just in EU press but also in Pan-African press?
Well, we conducted a study during the EU-Africa Summit because we wanted to compare the coverage. And one of the key findings was that there's a disconnect between both coverage. So Europe would focus more on human rights, migration, governance, security issues, whereas the African media, by and large, would be more interested in economic trade issues. So there's a gap. EU-Africa as such is not newsy, it's very institutional. It doesn't bring very compelling stories, and I think it's a pity because there's probably more to the story than just the institution. institutional side of the EU-Africa partnership.
And so I suppose my next question, you being a kind of an expert on Africa and the EU, what made you decide to start up a firm that really specialises in this topic, given the gap and also given some of the problems that you've talked about?
Well, there are two reasons.
Yeah.
The first one is I used to work for quite a long time for one of the most powerful industry lobby here in Brussels. And it was clear, I could see it on a daily basis, that African interests were not represented where it matters, which means at some level. So that's one reason. The other one is related, because it's important for economic actors, especially in Africa, to understand that Europe, the EU, typically promotes its own policies worldwide. And it means that any global regulation or global rule usually has a root in Brussels, and vice versa. When Brussels makes a decision, it is promoted at a global level. So it's very important to understand the two dynamics and be able to connect the dots, especially as the continent is rising, to understand what's going on here and to master the EU decision-making process.
Which is a complicated one.
Exactly.
So thanks a lot for coming on the show today, Annie. I think that, and I hope that we've been able to give you a good oversight of the political implications, but also the opportunities of EU-Africa relations. Thanks for listening. And next month, I'm going to be speaking to you about whether Africa needs more milk. Yes, it sounds bizarre, but that's what we're going to be speaking about. Also, I'm going to give you a rundown of the political discussions that are going on in Brussels, always asking the question, what's in it for Africa? So stay tuned on YouTube and on Twitter, and I'll see you next month.
Yes.